My name is Mike Adams. I'm the Product Innovation Manager at Camden BRI, and I'm here to talk to you about how we can help meet the alt meat and milk boom and overcome some of the challenges that producers face when reformulating with plant-based materials. What I'm going to cover in this webinar is why all of the interest in plant-based, certainly why all the interest in plant-based alternatives to meat and milk. I'm also going to talk about some of the challenges. So some of the challenges around how we convert animal products to plant-based products, and then also how we overcome some of the challenges around making plant-based healthier. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the future of alternative meat and touch on a little bit the future of alternative milk. I won't be covering lab-based or cultured animal meats or milks. That's not because they are not interesting or potentially game-changing, but that's a presentation all by itself. And if there's any interest, certainly happy to put a presentation together to cover that. So let's talk a little bit about the plant protein market or the plant-based market. I think everyone knows there's significant growth in plant-based products over the past decade. Milk and meat by far the two largest categories for consumer products. The next biggest categories being kind of based on plant-based milk, being like plant-based yogurts, plant-based ice creams. And there's lots of different figures from lots of different surveys, but on average between 5 and 8% annualized growth rate forecast over the next decade, taking it from what is already quite a significant market to a very sizable market. So there's a huge opportunity in terms of supplying these products to consumers. Now, what is interesting is that the growth isn't in every product type, not in every product category. So one thing that's quite interesting we've seen over the past few years is whilst plant-based milk has grown significantly, it's grown very much in one particular direction. And as we can see in Germany and the UK, which are the two biggest markets for plant-based milk in Europe, soya milk has not grown significantly. 1% in the UK, 1.1% in Germany. Whereas what we've actually seen, where we've seen the growth is in non-soy based plant milk. So we're talking things like almond milk, oat milk, coconut, where we've seen tremendous growth. Nearly 30% growth in the UK over the past 5 years. And that really is forecast to continue. I mean, that's compound annualized growth rate. So in some years that figure is likely to be higher. And we're maybe seeing a slight plateauing of growth, but really is in plant-based milks, we're really seeing a decline in the use of soya. However, that is not true for all categories. This is a chart showing the protein source or the protein base in the top 25 plant-based meat products by dollar sales in the US in 2020. And as you can see, soy still being a very, very significant portion of that. Of the 25, 20 contain soy, either by itself in the case of 3, but usually in combination with wheat or pea. With, as you can see, soy and wheat being the most popular combination. So, it really does show that although soy in the milk category is showing a lack of demand and a lack of growth, almost flat growth over the past 5 years, soy protein is still in high demand in terms of manufacturing. And that's really for a number of reasons. It is available in huge quantities, both as a crop, and as a purified protein isolate or protein concentrate. Soy protein isolate or concentrate have been around for a number of years. So there was a market already there. It was the most popular source of plant-based protein versus kind of whey protein and casein in the sports nutrition field. So it's already a very developed supply chain, and it's a large crop grown in a number of countries globally, which means from a price perspective, it's very attractive. It's also a very functional protein. It has good quality protein in terms of nutritionally, and you are able to turn it into meat analogs. As you can see, often with the addition of things like wheat protein or gluten protein as well. But it really goes to show there's a dichotomy emerging in the market here of, in some segments soya decreasing, and you're seeing a real growth in kind of emerging protein sources. However, the same cannot be said for meat, where soya is still king, and whilst a lot of NPD is going on in using things like pea protein, certainly in the big market, which is the US, soy is still remaining the most popular. But we're seeing significant demand in the UK. A couple of news articles here. The UK is the largest market in Europe for meat alternatives and plant-based milk. As you can see, this was 2018, where over a third of the European market was in the UK. And that's really been reflected in industry as well. We're seeing large plant-based factories opening in the UK, making use of capitalizing on that market. However, one thing is clear, the raw materials that are feeding that demand, the vast majority come from outside of the UK. There is at the moment no large-scale manufacture of protein concentrates or protein isolates for plant-based meat in the UK, and the pea protein, for example, which is one of the most popular sources of protein for plant-based meats, is coming from outside of the UK, even though we're one of the largest growers of peas in Europe. So there's quite a few air miles in terms of sources of these ingredients. Slightly different story for milk. Milk, obviously, we don't grow a lot of almonds in the UK, or coconuts. So those materials tend to come from outside of the UK. But oat milk is really gaining traction as one of the most popular milk alternatives. Often, we grow a lot of oats in the UK, and I'd hope that some of those oat milks on the market are being made using British oats, because, as I say, we are one of the biggest oat growers in Europe. And why are British consumers buying so much plant-based meats and drinking so much plant-based milk? Well, there's three primary motivations that you see when you speak to people consuming these products. We've got animal welfare, obviously one of the longest standing justifications or reasons for seeking out alternatives to animal byproducts. Lots of concern, people, and I say historically one of the longest standing reasons for people taking up meat alternatives, and it's not going to go away. It's people still are. It's not one that's grown massively over the past 10 years, but it's still a significant factor as to why people are seeking out alternatives to animal byproducts. There's health concerns. So, there's been significant press over the past few years about processed meat being negative for health, and a lot of interesting studies showing the benefits of a vegan diet. So, there's a significant amount of the population out there that are seeking out plant-based alternatives because they feel that they are a healthy alternative. And it's certainly true that plant-based products, whether it's meat or milk or some of the other plant-based alternatives out there, have what we call a health halo. They are assumed to be healthier than the animal based versions, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as to why that's not always necessarily true. But as I say, once that association is there, it's very difficult to get away, move the public opinion away from the fact that they feel that they are healthier. One concern which has grown significantly over the past 10 years is the environmental concerns. A huge amount of people out there are moving to a plant-based diet or more of a plant-based diet because they feel that eating plant-based foods drinking plant-based drinks is better for the environment than animal byproducts. And this, in some ways, is one of the strongest arguments. There's been a huge amount of published work showing that our use of animals in our diets is a huge contributory factor to CO2 levels and anthropogenic climate change. So it's a growing argument and one of the main drivers that's we've seen increase over the past few years. And then there's a smaller motivation, but I think a very important one to talk about, which again has been here been around for a significant period of time, is allergen or intolerance and avoidance. And this is certainly very important for the milk market. Huge amount of people out there drink plant-based milks, because they're intolerant of lactose or allergic to milk-based proteins. So again, very important for those consumers because they have no other choice, and a significant portion of the market. So just to summarize, we're seeing significant growth in plant-based meat and plant-based milk over the past decade, and it's forecast to grow at quite high levels. Milks and meat are the headline categories, but we're seeing some expansion in others, some based on milk, such as ice cream and yogurt, and then we've got some very new products come to the market in things like egg replacement. That is a very challenging sector. Egg is an incredibly functional ingredient, but we're seeing some really interesting products coming onto the market, either as ingredients in things like cakes, or to be used to make products that are mainly eggs, such as omelets and scrambled eggs. And as we just talked about, demand driven by three main concerns, but allergies and intolerances remaining a strong legacy driver. Plenty of people out there crying out for new products. And that sort of market growth really is an incentive to innovate in the plant-based space. People are not going to stop buying plant-based meat and plant-based milk, and it's very likely that they will buy more. The largest market by far is for casual consumers, the so-called flexitarians, where people are swapping out part of their diet for plant-based alternatives. And one thing is clear is that consumers want to replace current products like for like. So if they don't want new things, they want the same sensations, the same hedonism that they've had eating animal byproducts, and they want to be able to just swap, pay the same, for it to taste the same and look the same. A great example of this is the famous Greg vegan sausage roll. That worked well because of the fact that people were able to swap to plant-based without having to sacrifice the fact that they enjoyed their sausage rolls. And this is really driving producers to try and match in-market products. And anybody that works in NPD will tell you that this is by far the hardest type of new product development, trying to match in-market products. Certainly when you're taking out very, very useful ingredients such as animal proteins, which tend to be very functional in terms of what they do to the properties of the material. And one market that we can learn from is the allergen-free market. So gluten-free bread is a great example of where both there are significant challenges in terms of you have a unique protein like gluten to replace, and also the fact that gluten-free bakers have spent significant time and money over the past 10 years to take gluten-free bread from what was a poor substitute 10 or 15 years ago to breads now where you're getting very, very close to the eating experience, the taste, and the texture of conventional wheat-containing bread. And that's been a long, difficult journey for gluten-free bakers, and required significant investment from people like ingredient suppliers in order to get those functional ingredients that can help replace those gluten proteins within the bread. And it really highlights some of the challenges that certainly the plant-based meat sector are going to face in terms of trying to replace those proteins, and highlight some of the challenges. And just to talk about some of those challenges, in terms of making plant-based meat, they tend to fall into three main categories. We have the technological challenges. We've got some supply chain challenges, and then finally, once you have your product, we have some commercial challenges. And it's important to realize that all three of these are interlinked. You've got to understand that each of these challenges cannot be addressed in isolation. You cannot find a technological solution to your problem without considering the implications on supply chain and the implications on commercial. And that's the same whichever way you look at it. So just to put a bit more meat on the bones, or plant-based meat on the bones, I should say, breaking down some of the main challenges in making plant-based meats. So in terms of the technological challenges, this is around product design, making sure you're delivering what your customer wants. You've got things like texture, appearance, flavor, and then there's a food safety aspect that has to be considered. Food safety of meat is very well understood. It's challenging, but those challenges are very well understood, and a huge amount of work has gone in, the past 100 years to make sure that we can understand the safety implications of meat. The consumer education piece about the dangers of raw meat and about cooking it properly, how long chilled meat can stay on shelf for before you have risk of things like botulism. Those challenges, safety challenges, are not as well understood for plant-based meat, and they may well be different. And it may well be that consumers' understanding of how to treat plant-based meats are different because of those challenges. They may assume that you have to treat plant-based meat like you treat meat, and it may well be the challenges, food safety challenges, are different enough that there are safety implications there. Something that Camden BRI are doing a lot of work on at the moment in terms of challenge testing plant-based meats to understand their shelf life and really understand the risk. In terms of texture, appearance, and flavour, they're all very much part of the kind of three sides of the same coin, if that analogy works. And it's about the design of the product. What ingredients and what process do you use to make your meat as appealing as possible? And as we've talked about, making it as similar to existing animal meat products as possible, whether that's mince or whether that's a piece of protein like a chicken nugget or a steak. And then moving on, we have the supply chain issues. So this is certainly a key thing to consider when you're maybe looking at some of the newer ingredients on the market. There's a huge amount of different proteins that are available to be used. And one of the main challenges there is, what is the commercial stage of the production of that protein? Because there's lots of really interesting proteins out there that are a lab-based scale or pilot scale do very interesting things and can really produce some, really interesting textures, really interesting products, but there's no scale in terms of the production of that material. And what that means, if there's no scale, it means cost of the materials is high and the volumes available are low. And whilst this is a challenge I've talked about with some of the emerging proteins, it's a challenge for some of the existing proteins. Pea protein, for instance, this year has really seen the volume drop and the cost rise due to problems with harvest. So again, we have a long-standing supply chain for meat-based proteins or animal-based proteins. Plant proteins is still emerging. And whilst I talked about earlier soya being very mature, if you're not looking to use soy, there is a limited supply chain for other plant-based proteins at this time. And then once you have your product, you've designed it, you've secured your materials, you need to think about the commercial aspects. So what's the consumer attitude to your product? Are they willing to accept maybe you're using a source of protein that isn't that consumers will find disagreeable? The typical plant-based consumer is quite knowledgeable in terms of the food industry, so it may well be that they have concerns over some of the ingredients that you're using. How are you going to position your product? Are you going for putting it in the aisle with meat-based products? Have you spoken to your supermarket and the retailer about where you're going to put it, how you're going to sell it? What's your marketing message? How are you going to sell your product? And then finally, arguably one of the most important aspects from the commercial side is pricing. Can you make this product cheap enough that people can see it as a viable alternative? If you want to make a mainstream product, you have to be able to price it in such a way that people are not having to think twice about replacing their animal-based product with a plant-based product. And those certainly the supply chain and commercial aspects apply just as much to plant-based milks as they do to plant-based meats. Some of the technological challenges in milks are slightly different. I'll talk about those in a couple of slides' time. Just to drill down into what is arguably the biggest technical challenge for plant-based meat is texture and structure generation. And here are the 5 most common methods to produce texture with plant proteins. We've got mass market technologies, so fermentation with things like corn, extrusion, so that's the production of textured vegetable proteins, so soy being the most common, but we see soy and wheat blend also being very popular. And then we have fiber spinning, which is a technology that's been around for 70 years. And this is a way of producing fibers using soy, potentially mass market. I think still under patent by the inventor, but not very big, certainly in Europe, much more of a US. And there's a number of products have been on the market since the 1950s that traditionally used fiber spinning and have actually moved into using extrusion. Say extrusion is by far the single largest sector of plant protein texturizing, with estimates being, up to 80% of plant-based protein products, plant-based meat products being made using some form of extrusion. Obviously, corn use fermentation as primary is their way of generating texture and structure, and there are other companies working in this area, but corn remains, I think, the only mass market product currently using that. And then over towards the right, we have some much more experimental technologies. We have the shear cell, which uses similar principles to extrusion, but has advantages in it can make larger pieces of protein, so approaching kind of chicken breast size, which extrusion struggles to. And then we have 3D printing, which is producing some wonderful product, according to some of the articles that I've read, but again, is still very much a research scale technology. When we move on to talking about some of the challenges around plant-based milk, I've highlighted, the commercial we've talked about previously, but in terms of the technological challenges for milk, they really focus around 2. So we have the stability and the flavour. I'll talk about the flavour a little bit now. Dairy milk has a very distinctive flavour, and often when you're making a plant-based milk, it is very, very difficult to mimic that flavour, and often that's due to unwanted flavours coming from the materials that you're using. We have things like cereal notes, beanie notes. You can get some bitterness coming through from some of the materials that you can use, and there are ways of minimising those flavors, but it really does remain one of the main technical challenges in terms of making plant-based milks that are palatable to consumers. And there's a lot of consumers out there that are willing to taste different milks, and often some of those tastes can be quite pleasant, coconut for instance, but certainly some of the things like pea protein based milks can have flavors that need masking or removing prior to the milk being 100% acceptable to consumers. In terms of stability, one of the main challenges around milk is what people use milk for. Obviously, plenty of people out there drink it as it is, or add it to things like cereal, in which case stability is maybe not a huge challenge, but a significant portion of the population add milk to other materials or heat it up. And as an example for that, adding milk to coffee. Coffee is an incredibly hostile substance. It's hot. It can be quite acidic. And one of the challenges is it often causes plant-based milks to split. And you see a very similar effect as to if you add very old dairy milk to your coffee, and you get a not particularly pleasant lumpy cup of coffee. And ensuring that your emulsion remains stable can be a challenge. And often involves maybe different processing methods, different ingredients, and that can be a challenge to get that right. And it's certainly true that a lot of plant-based milks on the market still don't quite have it right, because you still I certainly see when I have plant-based milk and add it to my coffee, a number of them still don't mix in particularly well. And we've talked about consumer attitudes a couple of times, and these are critical to address for both milks and meats. And these are 5 of the main kind of questions or areas that you see raised by people when talking about plant-based meat or plant-based milk. Is how healthy is it compared with the animal versions? We'll talk about that a little bit later on the next slide. We've got soy concerns. As I say, not a huge issue for milk. We've seen plant-based milk really move away from soy over the past 5 years. But in meat, especially, a lot of certainly British consumers, not big fans of soy. It's still used in quite a few plant-based meats, either as soy protein or other soy-based ingredients. And there's a number of concerns there around things like deforestation and GMOs. Ultra-processed foods getting more and more kind of recognition in the media around health challenges associated with ultra-processed foods. And it's true to say that both plant-based meat and plant-based milk would be classed as ultra-processed foods. Not all milks, but certainly most meats would be classed as ultra-processed foods according to various different ways of defining them. And there's a big challenge there around ensuring that it's we're trying to process them as less as possible, which is challenging when you have very specific things like textures and flavors that you want to hit. There are allergen worries. So we've got allergen worries in terms of wheat proteins, in terms of soya, and then there's a big cross-contamination risk, and we've seen in reports in the press of a number of products that are vegan having allergen warning on them for things like milk and egg. So there's a big challenge there around making sure that we keep people with intolerances or allergies safe by ensuring that the marketing message is on if there is a risk of cross-contamination. And then cost is king. If we want people to transition to a plant-based diet, we have to make sure that they're not going to be paying a premium, and that is a challenge because we need to use specialist manufacturing methods. We need to use specialist ingredients, and unfortunately, they both tend to add costs. We've got very, very mature supply chains for animal products within the UK, especially, and globally. Those same supply chains are not yet in place for plant-based, and that tends to add cost. So it's very important to make sure costs are as low as possible. And just one area to talk about, mentioned that is a concern, is plant-based proteins or plant-based products have a halo. People assume that they're healthier, and I just want to talk about 4 of the main areas regarding health and just kind of compare and contrast slightly. So we talk about macronutrients. So macronutrients are things like protein, fiber, carbohydrates, sugar, fat. And how do they compare? So plant-based meats typically have a higher level of fiber and carbohydrate than equivalent meat versions. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Fiber consumption is something to be encouraged, but it does mean protein levels tend to be lower. Plant-based milk often lower in fat and protein, higher in carbohydrates and fiber. This can be an issue because certain populations require the fat and protein from animal milk that they wouldn't get from plant-based milk. And that's certainly true for groups of consumers such as young children. In terms of micronutrients, we're talking about vitamins and minerals. Animal proteins tend to include high levels of things such as iron, zinc, and B vitamins in very bioavailable forms. That means very easy to absorb and for the body to use them. Now, you can fortify plant-based products, whether that's plant-based milk or plant-based meat, to give very similar levels, but there are questions around how bioavailable those vitamins and minerals are, so how easy they are for the body to absorb and utilize. Just to pick on milk, dairy milk has a very high level of vitamin D, which is a very important vitamin. Again, plant milk can be fortified with vitamin D. There's a number of very good vitamin Ds on the market, but again, they may not be as bioavailable when added to plant-based milk. So again, it's the difference between what's on the label and what effect it actually has on consumers. In terms of FSS, we're talking about fat, sugar, and salt. Talk about salt first of all. Typically, salt reduction strategy has been, certainly in the UK, has been one of gradual reduction in many categories. Often there isn't a magic silver bullet to take salt out and put something else in, and a lot of savoury categories have gone with just gradually reducing it over a number of years. Given the newness of plant-based meat, it's a category that has been around for a while, but it's still relatively new, relatively young, and has been relatively low profile, so has escaped kind of a lot of attention. This hasn't quite happened yet, and often with the flavour challenges that plant-based meats have, salt levels are typically higher than their meat-containing equivalents or their animal protein-containing equivalent. So there's maybe something to address there in terms of making sure salt levels are brought down. In terms of fat, we've talked on it a little bit in the macronutrients. Fat is a fairly controversial nutrient, and there's controversies around the health effects of fat. But putting that aside, most plant-based meats and milks do not deliver the same fatty acid profile. This is most likely a positive because they have lower levels of saturated fat, but it may be seen as a negative by some people. Plant milks typically have a lower level of fat than cow's milk, and the fat in plant milk tends to be unsaturated, rather than saturated. Sugar, not a huge issue for plant-based meats. They don't typically have a high sugar content. In some reviewed products, it is higher than the meat equivalents, but in real terms, it's quite insignificant, because although it is slightly higher, it's still very low. So it's not necessarily a huge concern. Similar tends to be true for plant milk. Protein quality. So protein quality is a measure of how much a protein or a blend of proteins deliver the essential amino acids that humans require. So amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and there are some amino acids that humans need in their diet, because others that they can make themselves, we can make ourselves. But there are a selection of amino acids that we call essential, and we score proteins based on how much of these essential amino acids they deliver. In plant proteins, these range from good, which means it has a PD-Cas, which is a measure of quality of protein in terms of its range of amino acids, is a score of more than 0.8. Now, a score of 1 is casein, which is a milk protein. And some vegetable proteins or plant proteins that score well are things like soy and potato, which score above 0.8. And these range down to low, with a PD-Cas score of about 0.2 or 0.4, such as corn or almond protein. So it really just shows a huge range of challenges there in plant-based. And it is fair to say that not all plant-based products are as healthy as animal-based products, but it is not black and white. It's very much shades of grey, and it tends to be a mixture of good and bad, better in some areas, worse in others. But it's very difficult to say conclusively that processed plant protein-based milk and meat are definitely better for you than animal. It's very, very much the pros and cons. And delivering against all of the challenges we've outlined. So we've outlined a number of the challenges. We've talked about some of the ways around it, some of the different methods when selecting a protein source or technology. You've really got to balance some of the quality attributes that ingredients or methods deliver, whether that's a production technology or whether that's a certain source of protein that maybe delivers good texture, good taste, or good nutrition, versus the commercial challenges, which could be cost, it could be allergen profile, or it could be availability. You really have to balance the priorities to give consumers what they want, whilst ensuring that the ingredients you use are in supply and the finished product is cost effective. It is a fast-moving sector. Lots of new ingredients coming to market, so important to constantly review, adapt, and update your product and your product portfolio. New processing technologies much slower in coming to market than ingredients, but lots of interesting work's being done. And as other industries have shown, where the process has not essentially changed for decades, there's lots you can do to make incremental improvements. Great. Again, going back to the gluten-free bread example, the majority of those improvements in product quality have been based on ingredient technology rather than process technology. But there have been some small and important changes to processing that have unlocked the use of some ingredients. What does the future hold? Well, I think it's clear that the market is moving beyond soy and wheat. We've seen in plant-based milk, soy becoming very much an also-ran. Still one of the biggest plant-based milks available in terms of market share, but very little growth. In terms of plant-based meat, wheat protein is very, very functional, very useful, but certainly it's a protein that a lot of people are looking to avoid in their diet. So, the growth of pea, there's a new plant in the UK opening up soon to produce potato protein. So really, at the moment, soy and wheat by far the most used in meat, but the market is moving beyond that. In terms of milk, as we've talked about, soy becoming still a good cash cow for the producers, but really very much an afterthought. Customers becoming much more discerning. They know what they want. There's a lot of competition out there. They will pick and choose the best products. We're seeing a lot of companies' growth really tailing off over the past couple of years, and that is because the market is becoming saturated in both milk and meat. Consumers have so much more choice now than they did even 5 years ago. And that means that consumers will vote with their wallets and they will buy the best products. So it really makes it important that you are delivering an excellent product that ticks as many boxes as possible for the consumers. Seafood is an area where there's not been a huge amount of products launched. It's one of the most challenging sectors to deliver plant-based products in, but it is also one where we're seeing the most growth now because there are a number of technologies out there, some excellent new flavors on the market, delivering great seafood and a variety of seafood flavors as well. So expect significant growth in vegan seafood offerings over the next few years. And then I alluded to it a little bit at the beginning of the webinar, cultured meat and cultured plants and cultured milk all becoming potentially very significant, still very much lab scale and more of a curiosity at the moment, but it's technology that can be scaled very, very quickly. So it's certainly worth looking at and considering, because arguably it will make plant-based meat irrelevant in the coming decades, because you will remove certainly two of the biggest concerns in terms of environmental and animal welfare for certainly animal protein in the form of meat. In cultured plants, it's more around things like algae, which has a huge variety of species, a huge variety of nutrients and functional proteins. And algae's been there or thereabouts for a number of years. No one's quite cracked it, but there's a number of companies doing some very interesting work where, again, you can really tailor the algae to produce the particular compounds that you want. Very environmentally friendly, no deforestation to grow algae. So potentially a very interesting sector in terms of sources of plant protein. Thank you very much for listening to this webinar. You'll see at the bottom my email address. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions about things that I've talked about, and I'd be more than happy to answer your questions. And if I can't answer them, I'm more than happy to put you in touch with one of my colleagues here at Camden BRI who may be able to. Thank you very much.